Allow me to very quickly introduce our panelists. Their topic is legal and security threats to independent journalism, navigating repressive environments. And on that panel is Mr. Chris Mike, who is a legal professional and qualified journalist with expertise in human rights, media, criminal, constitutional, and aviation law. He holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Zimbabwe and a Master's of Law specializing in intellectual property and communications law from Michigan State University in the USA. He's also served on the Zimbabwe Media Commission between 2010 and 2015. Please put your hands together for Mr. Chris Mike as he comes up. Alongside him is also another legal professional with more than 10 years of experience in human and digital rights, freedom and expression, and access to information. She holds a master's in intellectual property and technology law and has led initiatives advancing online freedom, accountability, and democratic governance. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen Sitole from the Media Institute of Southern Africa. Maybe Mr. Mike can do the honors of assisting her up those stairs. We have all the way from Kenya, one of our regional delegates. We have Judy Kaberia. She's a multiple award-winning journalist and the executive director of the Association of Media Women in Kenya. She has over 16 years of journalism experience and is deeply passionate about public policy, human rights, transitional justice, and gender equality. Please put your hands together for Judy. Karibu, Karibu, we welcome you very warmly to Zimbabwe and to this panel. And steering this discussion will be none other than Ngaba Machazi. He is MISA's Regional Campaigns Coordinator, a media freedom advocate, journalist who is passionate about journalist safety, media independence, and he champions press freedom in Southern Africa and is very proudly a father of 2 girls. Ngaba, please come up. And as I said, he will be chairing this panel, and we look forward to that discussion.
Good morning. My question to Chris is, how come he's not helping me? I'm the only one that wasn't helped to come up on stage. For a very long time, I worked for Alpha Media Holdings, 10 years, I think, 10 years to the day, to be honest. And I've moved from journalism to civil society for the past 5 years. This is what I've been doing. I've moved from front pages to talking about impact and other issues. And one of the biggest impacts which we had at AMH was the criminal defamation, the striking down of criminal defamation sometime in 2014 and 2016. Because we went to court twice. The second time I went with Chris as our lawyer. It seems he's everyone's lawyer. When you get in trouble, you call on Chris. So while we had so much progress in 2013, we had a new constitution. We went back to court in 2015, 2016, because the judges had said that the law had not been tested under the new constitution. So we had to come back to court. And we argued. I think the argument lasted less than 5 minutes. The previous Chief Justice said, oh, how does a new constitution resurrect something that was never there? But we thought we had seen a new dawn. But we are still here. We still get people being arrested. I think I have not interacted with AMH in the past 5 years. The closest I've been is going to see Faith and Blessed in court. Now, to ask you, where is the widest gap between the constitutional protections and the lived reality of independent journalists on the ground? Because when we're looking at it like this, we have a very good constitution with very good provisions, but we still find journalists being arrested for the flimsiest of things. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, colleagues. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, old faces and new faces. Welcome to Harare. So I want to start on a more positive note. We are in a crisis. You are right, Trevor, about that. But we have many more tools today to use in expressing ourselves and in calling to order those that wield power over us. You will know that the 2013 Constitution now includes an express provision for press freedom, which we did not have in the 1979-1980 Constitution. And therefore, because of the more expansive nature of the Bill of Rights in the new Constitution, we have a better opportunity to bring to fruition the freedoms that are promised under our law. Trevor is having problems with democracy, understanding what exactly we mean by democracy. One of the simplest definitions of democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So what we find in many pseudo-democracies are governments that are ruling for themselves, governments ruling for the elite. And we cannot say because they have failed in interpreting what democracy is a bad thing. Democracy is the best model of governance, Trevor, with respect. It's the best model of governance that we've seen. I do hear that there is very impressive infrastructure, and there are many billionaires in some of the nations that you have visited. That is not the mark of a good life. The fact that someone is living in a mansion with millions of dollars in their strong room, that is not the standard of a good life. Someone can live in a simple house in Makokoba or in Zengeza and be happier because they are free. So freedom is at the center of a good life. This is what I believe. So we do have a good constitution. It's got its weaknesses, but because it promises us that we shall have freedom of expression and freedom of the media, we take that positively. And the challenge, therefore, to those in the room, the journalists and non-journalists, is to take up those rights, take up those promises, and demand that they be respected. We have a problem because too many of us citizens do not stand up to claim our rights. Some do not even know that they have rights. We therefore have a duty as the media to educate the general public about their rights as they are promised in the Constitution, and therefore to encourage them to exercise them. So there is, of course, a gap between what is promised and what is lived in reality. And everyone has a duty. Every journalist has a duty to demand that their freedom, which is promised in the Constitution, is respected. Another gap relates to the laws, the statutes that are passed in Parliament. Too many of the statutes are not consistent with the promises that are in the Constitution. Again, it is our duty as journalists and as citizens to ensure that there's an alignment between the toxic or draconian pieces of legislation that are passed in Parliament, where this democracy is not fully represented, but to ensure that those laws are aligned with the Constitution. Only last week, Alpha Media Holdings was in this Constitutional Court. Kudos to Trevor and team, challenging the constitutionality of the Cyber and Security, Cyber and Data Protection Act provision, which is now part of the criminal law code, which says it shall be a crime to transmit false data messages. It's a recreation of old laws that were in IPA and in other so-called repealed laws. So Alpha Media Holdings took it upon themselves to say, we are challenging the constitutionality of this law. And the ConCourt is now seized with the matter. We expect a ruling to be made in due course as to whether or not Alpha Media Holdings has a right to have direct access to the ConCourt. That is the sort of leadership that we want. And that is the sort of culture of challenging that will help us accomplish a more perfect democracy that we all deserve.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I'll get back to you. Hopefully, we'll have enough time to speak. You see, the problem with lawyers, when they start speaking, they don't stop. I hope we'll have more time to speak about the demand and the supply side of rights, because while there's a supply side, but the demand side is very weak. Okay, I'll leave you for now and move over to Helen. For those at the back, Chris is carrying the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Being a lawyer, that's why the verbosity. I hope Helen is not carrying the same, so that we're not stuck here for a long time. Helen, there's a media law reform process that is going on in Zimbabwe. It's been dragging on for a very long time. For example, the issue of co-regulation and statutory regulation. I've seen some regulators in the room. That's why I'm looking at you directly and not at them, because it's going to be a long afternoon for me. So what needs to happen for the ongoing media law reform process to genuinely align Zimbabwe's legal framework with regional and international standards for press freedom, such as the ACHPR? This comes against the background of discussions of media policy, core and self-regulation.
Okay, I'm not carrying the constitution. So Zimbabwe is a party to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and as such, it has binding legal obligations to ensure the rights that are enshrined in the Charter, more specifically under Article 9, that speaks to freedom of information, freedom of expression, and access to information. So because we are a party to that Charter, we have to have those laws effected within our legislation. So we do have freedom of expression, as Mike rightfully expressed, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, the right to access information held by public institutions is echoed in our constitution under section 61 and 62. So we are making some positive progress towards that end. But when we look at our laws, they need further alignment. I think Trevor mentioned that we still have colonial laws that speak to sedition, which impact heavily on the work that journalists do. So for me, we need to make progress towards that end. When we speak about co-regulation and self-regulation, it's echoed under the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression that was issued by the African Commission. So under that principle, it's highlighted that there is need for the media to self-regulate in order to promote accountability, transparency. So that model is echoed in our Zimbabwe media policy that was launched earlier this year. It does make mention of it in as far as it being a mechanism to counter misinformation, which is rife within our social media platforms, and also to promote accountability within the media fraternity. So a look at how the self-regulation or co-regulation model will look like. It's the media industry itself coming up with standards, coming up with a complaints mechanism, having the state having limited powers, and also coming in with oversight powers, which are clearly defined. So for me, that's what co-regulation would mean. And for me, I think it's a positive development having it mentioned in our Zimbabwe media policy. So Zimbabwe is not all doom and gloom when it comes to our legislation. We've seen in recent years the repeal of the IPA, which was very restrictive, and the coming in of the Freedom of Information Act, the Zimbabwe Media Commission Act. Those are all positive progress towards professionalizing the media industry, but still more work needs to be done. The Freedom of Information Act, different stakeholders are not fully aware of the request process, the information request process. So there needs to be inroads towards that end. But we're moving slowly, but hopefully with more workshops like this, more dialogue around the issue, there'll be advocacy to push for the reforms that we want to see in order to create the media industry that we want, that holds the powers that be to be accountable. Thank you.
Okay, just sticking with you, maybe on a legal terms here, and also just referring to what Chris said earlier. We have a case around 2011, 2012, me not being a lawyer and not knowing anything about case law, Chimakure versus the state or whatever versus the state, but it was Chimakure on one hand, where he was arrested for publishing falsehoods. The Constitutional Court said that fell away. He was acquitted and that section was struck off. Now, you find that the Cyber and Data Protection Act brings back that publication of falsehoods and criminalizes it again. Then you have another case, Madanire and Ngaba, wherever he is, go to court again and challenge criminal defamation. But the Cyber and Data Protection Act also criminalizes that. So where is this mismatch? And even speaking about the instruments that you speak about, they all have provisions saying, let's not criminalize falsehoods, let's not criminalize defamation. But we find that we are still doing it here. There's a mismatch. I like that you are very optimistic, but we are still stuck here in this mismatch.
I'm an optimistic person. Okay. So that's the problem with our laws. When I say we need to realign them with the spirit of the Constitution, the Cyber and Data Protection Act, as you rightfully mentioned, does bring backdoor the criminal defamation as a sanction against journalists and human rights defenders who are mostly affected. So it is problematic. So I think as different stakeholders, we need to advocate for the amendment or removing of those clauses altogether. The African Court has actually called on states to remove their criminal defamation laws. Maybe I'll leave it to Senior Counsel to add on.
So we do have a problem in addition to the misalignment of statutes with the Constitution. There is also a culture problem. So there is reference to the letter and the spirit of the law. We are in a fairly good space in terms of the letter of the law. We have many protections on paper. But in terms of now living the spirit of the law, we have major problems. There is no democratic culture. While the law says people shall be free to express themselves, we are coming maybe from a society where kings and chiefs and headmen would not be criticized. And therefore, that culture of immunity from criticism is yet to be dealt with. So we must, as a society, deal with this cultural problem of lack of respect for the law or failure to fully understand what democracy means in terms of freedom of expression and press freedom. I was involved in a case in 2021 with a prominent citizen, Fadzai Mahere, who was arrested in January 2021 for peddling falsehoods. It will help you to hear what the allegation was. So she was arrested for publishing or communicating false statements prejudicial to the state, as defined in Section 31 of the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act. We brought it to the attention of prosecutors, the state, that this is no longer part of our law, and made reference to some of the cases that you've mentioned. But only a few months earlier, in the case of State versus Hopo Chingono, the High Court had made clear that peddling falsehoods is no longer an offense under the new constitution, as read with previous cases that had been dealt with in court. They said, well, that's your defense. Say that in court. And we went to trial, the whole trial. and she was convicted by a magistrate for peddling falsehoods and was freed only at the High Court on appeal. When the judge questioned the state, are you not aware of this judgment? Are you not aware of this court order? I do not believe that none of the people in the National Prosecuting Authority and none of the judicial officers in the Judicial Service Commission was aware over the 2 years of the illegality of this prosecution. I'm sure they were aware. When I approached one of the prosecutors after acquittal in the High Court, she said, we knew that is no longer law, but we had to do it. So we have a cultural problem. That's the short answer to that question.
That's a very long, short answer. Just to give you further context, in 2016, Polisani, Sfigile, and myself were again also arrested for publishing falsehoods, and we went up to the Constitutional Court. When we got to the Constitutional Court, the state said, "Oh, sorry, the fundamentals of the crime, whatever," and we walked out in 5 minutes. So it's quite dispiriting and very frustrating when you go through such stuff. Judy, you are the third one in my book and the last one to be asked a question, and it was deliberate because you are my tribe. In Zimbabwe and Kenya, I know tribe carries lots of connotation. I mean, a journalist who also moved into civil society. That's why I'm talking about tribe. A few years ago, I invited a colleague to a workshop where we're discussing some of the issues that we're discussing here. And one of the things that he said was, Chief, leave me out of these things. These things are abstract. They have nothing, I have nothing to do with those things. So my question is to you, someone who's breached civil society and is into, journalism and civil society, is how can independent media houses, freelance journalists, and civil society organizations foster greater solidarity and unified advocacy to counter state threats effectively?
Thank you very much for that question. First, I would like to make a clarification. I'm working with the Frederick Naumann Foundation. I was executive director of AMWIC, but now I'm at the Frederick Naumann Foundation working as a senior project manager. So I've not deserted Umtoba and Miklos and Fungisai. Yeah. For me, it talks personally to my own life, having been an investigative journalist for very many years, more than 15 years. And having lived in the reality of what it means to be an investigative journalist, I'm very happy that I'm on the other side and also with the Frederick Naumann Foundation, which actually makes a lot of emphasis on working with the journalists. Looking back at the projects we have, including what we have here in Zimbabwe, and we are doing this also at the regional level. For example, in East Africa, we are working in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda. And what we've realized is the need for us to know how we can insulate ourselves. And we believe in the power of networking, where sometimes we're able to push the agenda when we are more at the regional level. And so what we've done, for example, is to combine the civil society and the media, because a lot of times we are fighting for the same cause. And coming together, then it helps us to understand each other, because there's been a disconnect where the media works separately and the civil society works separately. And then we've realized when the media is under attack, a lot of time they're fighting their battles alone. But when we work with the civil society, at least we have the synergy. I'll just give you some examples. For example, what we've done in Kenya, we formed the Kenya Media Sector Working Group, which is a group of more than 20 media associations. During the Gen Z protests in Kenya, journalists were targeted. I remember one female journalist was shot 3 times on the thigh. So police, they go out and they target the journalists. And then they went to the satellites where they have their signals and they switched off these signals. So what we did is to work very fast with the civil society, the Law Society of Kenya and other civil societies. They ran to the court as the rest of the media associations held a press conference to protest. So this synergy between the civil society and the media really needs to be connected. We need to have frequent meetings, networking meetings, where the journalists talk about the challenges they are facing, because they face a lot of challenges. My incident at the airport yesterday is another story altogether. I've been a journalist a long time ago, but it's strange that the shadow keeps on following me, and I found it very strange. So this means that it's a very challenging time for the journalists. And now more than ever, civil society development partners, we really have to work together. And I like the fact that for us to shine, for us to thrive, then our defense is the quality of journalism, is professionalism, is living to the cause, because we're in journalism as leaders. And what do we require from a leader? It's about integrity, it's about responsibility, it's about being the shoulder to be leaned on in times of crisis. And if you look at Africa right now, we're in times of crisis, and the media is the hope that we have. If we don't have freedom of the media, if the media cannot speak for the people, then no one else will speak. And even the governments, sincerely speaking, they have gone to the government because the media was there. They used the media as a platform. And if we look at the government at the same time, they also need the people to get the information. And media is not always about just corruption. It's not just about just being the watchdog of the bad things. It's about information. It's about health information. It's about COVID, where we are giving people information. It's about media for development. Until we start looking at media as an integral partner in all our lives, all spheres of our lives, talking about the traffic is here, then that's when we decide that the media is a good ally, not because they dig into what we do, and it's for the benefit of everybody. The people we write about, we don't know them. You write a story, you don't know who you're writing about, but it's for the good of the society. And another thing that I would like us to do, for example, in Kenya, is where we are lobbying the members of parliament to change the oppressive media laws. We have 22 oppressive media laws in Kenya. So we've realized, of course, coming from a very difficult stand of, no, we demand our rights, it's not going to work. But this is where we need to have conversations, all of us together, because even if we meet the civil society and the media alone, we don't have the responsibility to change the law. So either way, we need to work together for the legislators to understand why these laws are oppressive, not only to us, also to them, because they need to get to the electorate. They need the electorate to be educated to understand what is their duty as electorate and what is the duty of a member of parliament. It's not about dishing cash, but it's about them delivering. So for us, is that synergy of working together, the civil society and the civil society, the development partners, to continue supporting the media. It is now tougher than ever before. There is extreme surveillance on journalists. It follows me after I left journalism. It follows me back to Zimbabwe. And I hope I'll go back home safely. So clearly, then this shows us the need to continue supporting the journalists. And I hope with all this financial crisis we are facing, that we are not going to forget the need to continue supporting the media.
There's one thing that you say that stuck with me. Everything stuck with me, but I wanted to talk about one thing. You spoke about that even the politicians, when they get into power, before they get into power, they'll have used the media and they are darlings to the media. But when they get in there, they change. It reminds me of the former president of Zambia. He was the lawyer for the Media Institute of Southern Africa in Zambia, and he actually drafted the Access to Information Law. He drafted. When he became president, he closed the post, which Trevor was speaking about. Okay, staying with you here for a second. You spoke about a lady who was shot, is it 3 times? But how does this constant threat of legal action or physical harm lead to a pervasive culture of self-censorship within independent newsrooms? And what critical stories are ultimately not being told as a result? I'll say this because I don't know, I'm not too sure. A journalist from Heart and Soul, lady, Changeto, after she was arrested, I saw some posts saying, I'm done with this profession. When I was arrested the first time, I'm like, hey, it's time to go to South Africa, because we all go to South Africa. When I was arrested the second time, it was 4 months before my wedding, and I'm like, hey, maybe I need an exit plan here. But now such voices, people who stand up to the government, they get lost, I mean, to the authorities. They get lost to the media loses quality. At the end of the day, media sells fewer papers or fewer eyeballs on TV. So this constant threat of physical and legal threat and self-censorship.
You're very right. When you are threatened, you self-censor yourself. Myself, I've been on asylum 2 times because I was reporting on justice and accountability for post-election violence in Kenya. And this time I had a very young daughter. And sometimes I would question, do I really need to change my job at this time? But then I realized, if I don't tell the story, who's going to tell the story? Because you are there covering the story. You've seen the victims who need justice, and you've seen vulnerable people who need their voices heard. And I didn't walk out at that time. I walked out actually when the cases collapsed. So the conviction, and this is where we say journalism with a purpose. And that's why he was talking about not journalism because we are public relations machine, but we're in journalism because we have to fulfill our purpose. And we're in journalism because we are leaders. And that's why, even though there's self-censorship, we still celebrate the resilience of journalists. We are here talking about journalists who've been in prison and come out before. And it's this hope that we have to hang on and continue to support them. Because yes, a lot of them are self-censoring themselves, but still you can see very bold stories are coming out. And they're coming out because we are having platforms such as this that make them to know that they're not on their own, but there are people actually who are backing them, there are organizations that are backing them. But also what we need to do is going back to traditional journalism, because there's been an erosion of quality of journalism, ethical reporting, the basics of quality journalism. Slowly by slowly, it's eroding. And we are resorting to the cliques of what he's talking about. And because also the newsrooms are not ready for the issues with financing, they start pushing journalists to pushing for for the likes instead of the quality of journalism. So what we need to do again, and I hope that even we, the development partners, the civil society, can look at how do we support journalism that is important for the society, that journalists are not chasing the clicks. Because to be honest, this is what the journalists are struggling with. And that's the reality. And that's a practical part of it. Every journalist is asking themselves, how will I pay my salary? How will I get my salary? That is the reality. Unless we have support for specialized kind of reporting, whether it's on justice, whether it's on accountability, whether it's investigation on human trafficking, on other specialized subjects, then it will be very difficult for the journalist of the day to chase quality content as opposed to chasing a story that trends. I remember the newsroom will say, today I'm breaking the website because I know I have a very big story. But the journalist of today is brief, no content. It's just so and so is dead, and that's it. And you start posting the videos. So we really have to think about how we support them. And even when you listen to all the stories that are here, the ones who are arrested were not on their own. There are people or organizations that are backing them. So we need to remind the journalists that they have a duty and they have a purpose to fulfill. And they should not be afraid of anything. Because also we have a new crop of journalists who, even before they do the story, they say there's no story worth on my life. We also have that journalist in the newsroom right now. The older generation, the millennials, can attest to that. So we really also need to think about mentorship. How do we mentor them? Because can you imagine a world where there is no journalism, there is no media? We are finished. So clearly, we really have to ensure that we are mentoring the younger ones who are coming back. We ensure that we equip them with the personal safety, with simple things that they can do to protect themselves. For example, every time I did a story that I knew was dangerous, I knew by the time this story is published, I'm out of the country.
Thank you very much. I wish I had a passport to be out of the country that isn't. Alan, this is the last anecdote connected to me, I promise. I think the year is 2010 or 2011. 2010 or 2011. I'm walking to work. I didn't have a car then. I still don't have a car, by the way. I'm walking to work. And the headline in the Herald was Gideon Gono sues AMH for 30 million US dollars, I think. I had the shock. I almost went home. It was a Saturday. I almost went home without even saying anything. The following day, another headline, Grace Mugabe sues AMH for 20 million. And all these stories were connected to me. And the last one, 2 weeks later, Thokozani Kupe sues Standard for 500,000. So imagine I'm walking into the office and I'm seeing my boss like, hey, chief, I might have cost the company. The company might have to close here. There is a new attack on journalists, strategic litigation against public participation. Now, in an environment like Zimbabwe, imagine being sued even for $10,000. How many newspapers, how many media houses can sustain that pressure, and what has to be done to deal with the issue of SLAPPs?
Thank you, Ngaba. So, the hallmark of SLAPPs is the David versus Goliath stamp on it. It's people with or institutions with financial muscle targeting other media houses or activists with less financial muscle. So that's like the hallmark of a SLAPP suit. There's no clear definition. So what needs to be done? I feel like there needs to be advocacy. maybe as the legal minds here, to develop jurisprudence around SLAPP suits. Because currently Zimbabwe doesn't have an anti-SLAPP legislation. We need to progress to have that in place to protect journalists, especially to protect activists and human rights defenders, because it tends to silence them. It tends to make them to self-censor. So we've seen that with the majority of media houses in Zimbabwe, they rely on donor funding or the odd investor. And because they rely on such investors, they cannot then do an investigative story on certain investors that are tied to their money trail, or they know which side of the bread is buttered, and to put it in a funny way. So we find that the journalism that they'll do will be sidelined. They'll sideline the hardcore cases because they don't want to step on someone's toes. So it affects them. It affects the issues that are in the public discourse, the issues that are brought to attention of the public. So I feel like at the end of the day, we need to move towards having anti-SLAPP laws in place to protect journalists.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. I think I've got 3 minutes left. It would be remiss of me. I still have a number of questions to ask, but it would be remiss of me not to ask this question. I'll come back to you, Judy. When I was being introduced, the last part, which is the closest part to my heart, is that I'm a proud father of 2 girls. And one issue that really, really sits with me, because my daughters, they love their gadgets, they love the TVs, and they're exposed to many things. But one issue that sits with me, but going back to journalism, is the issue of technologically facilitated gender-based violence. I know you've done work here in Zimbabwe, FNF, through womentorship, which was mentioned earlier. But we see that more women are getting deplatformed from online media. It's just not Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe might even be a kinder place, even if people as women journalists are being deplatformed. So, just to you, what do you think needs to be done to mitigate the effects of technologically facilitated gender-based violence and to make social media and other platforms more representative?
You're right. Actually, even before I joined FNF, I was also a beneficiary of the FNF programs. And I know this really gave me a lot of support, because what FNF has been doing is mostly to educate female journalists. For example, on even how to use social media for their own benefit. And of course, even build resilience. When you're a female journalist, you can imagine if you're just an ordinary journalist, you're facing a lot of challenges. When you're a woman, it's times 1,000 of what an ordinary journalist faces, because the scrutiny, the body shaming, intrusion of your privacy, intrusion of your family. It's happened to me as well as a journalist. And this is actually where you take off. Like for 3 days, you don't show up in public because of what has been said about you. Like I remember one of the photos, I was just putting a microphone to a source. So when I was pinning the microphone, this picture was shared online that I was a concubine of the source. And it went on for long. You can imagine how I'm able to face this with my family, with my kids and all that. So one of the things that should continue being done is, for example, what we've done at FNF. There's a lot of emphasis on female journalists, and we have a lot of beneficiaries who have gone through our programs. And it's basically to equip them with the skills. A lot of things are changing, and also equipping them with the right skills also to be better journalists, to be able to use technology to better their stories, and even having discussions for people to share their stories about what happens to them, what they feel about it. Because sometimes people don't understand. They tend to think journalists are metallic or plastic, that they don't have feelings. So also sharing their stories and what they have gone through is a very important platform. And in the media houses, some of them have developed social media policies on how to be able to use their social media, and also discerning it, simple tips of distinguishing between what you share in public and what you share in public, what you post, the photos that you post, because they're always changing them around. And now you can imagine with the technology, how they're able to change the images to put your face wherever they want, to even put a story or a byline of a story that you didn't do. So supporting the women journalists, including pushing for the establishment of gender-friendly policies. One of them is, of course, the unsexual harassment policies. This has been done very well in Kenya. Implementation is always a crisis. It's the same way we are saying democracy. There's nothing wrong with the democracy. The problem is it is not being implemented or people are not doing it.
All right, Judy.
Yes.
I'll have to cut you short there. Just to reach out, do we have question and answer? Maybe a round of questions, 3 questions that we can deal with very quickly. You say it's too serious deflation in this room. Yeah. I don't know if there's any question to the panelists. Okay, there's a lady in the back there. Another question? If there are no questions, I can ask them, or it shows that our panel was super good, or they were discussing things that fly over our heads, like technological facilitated gender-based violence. I trip on that term. All right, we have another question in the back here, and we have another question from Lloyd. I think that will do for now. Also,
Yes,
if you
yeah,
can tell us who the question is going to, and maybe introduce yourself very briefly.
All right, thank you. So my name is Emma Zionye and I'm a journalist in Zimbabwe. So my question is directed to Trevor and also to Chris on democracy.
Is Trevor on the panel? Let's check.
Oh, all right. It was a burning question when he was speaking.
Okay, I'm only joking.
Okay, so my question is, do our laws reflect a democracy? So Trevor mentioned a lot about how he's lived during the 90s and he hasn't seen democracy. So I want to ask Chris, do our laws reflect democracy, even when it comes to media laws and the law in general? Because we talk a lot about, is Zimbabwe a democratic country or it is something else? Because we want to label it as a democratic country, but are we really a democratic country? Even when it comes to elections, are we a democratic country?
Thank you. My name is Kudakwasha Matambo, representing the Zimbabwe Peace Project. Thank you very much, Chris and the other panelists for the reflections. I will not reflect on the question of democracy because of what Trevor said, because we believe in democracy and we believe in the promotion of human rights. And we believe that freedom of expression is the center of enjoying freedom and development in the country. Chris, you mentioned about the letter and spirit of the law. At ZPP, what we have noticed and documented is the suppression of freedom of expression, not just with journalists, but also with ordinary people. And sometimes when you go to verify cases and even want to look for litigants, to try and, stop the state from the state, political actors, or even village heads or traditional leaders, you find that people are really, really afraid. They don't even want to speak and express themselves in terms of how they are being denied their right to freedom of expression. Is there something that we can do legally, but also in terms of building citizen agency for people to really speak up, but also to try and stop all these magistrates, the judicial services, officers, and even sometimes people in the state security, to try and promote freedom of expression so that we can have a better developed and conversational society? Thank you.
Thanks, Ngaba, for a very engaging discussion. Thank you so much. My question is to Chris, because Chris said something that really stuck with me about the issue of prosecutorial independence. There was a time when I was on the bench, and I also witnessed this thing, that sometimes prosecutors, when they're dealing with political cases, they'll go ahead with it, even when they know it's unjustified. Now, what can be done to help prosecutors to really stand for what is right and to really protect their independence as professionals? Thank you.
Well, most of the questions were directed to me. Trevor, Trevor, here you are. Yeah, so I think the democracy question was presented to the both of us. You can start, Trevor, if you have a few comments on that question.
Well, I'm glad that we were engaging with this issue of democracy. This is how I'm going to answer it. So, Chris, you actually say that the people are battling understanding their constitutional rights. We need to pause there and say, why is that so? And then secondly, Ngaba, you talk about the president of Zambia, Misa, and then the next thing he comes in and he closes down the post. And Chris, you actually come up with a very interesting concept, which is you're not coming up, but you're surfacing it. Democratic culture. Okay. 43 years old, 43 years in a democracy, 60 years in a democracy, and we're still talking about the absence of a democratic culture. What I'm finding, I like relating stories. So I went to my pharmacist the other day and he says, is Blessed Mhlanga out? I get irritated when people ask me that question. You should know if Blessed Mhlanga is out or not. Is it something that interests you? Clearly, he didn't think it was important for him to follow up. But why I'm making that point is that people don't actually realize how important freedom of expression is. And you guys are gathering here and saying freedom of expression is fundamental to democracy because you understand what this is all about. You go on the streets and ask people how important freedom of expression is. They'll look at you and say, what are you talking about? We've got a problem with this thing called democracy. Okay. And for me, it's how do we make it realistic and lived as far as people are concerned? Chris himself says there's not democratic culture, not just in the streets, but within politicians, in parliament, in this legislature. Chris, you've come across this a number of times. Ngaba, you're saying it's dispiriting the number of times you've been in and out and so forth. Until when? Okay, so I'm positing here a thing that says what Ngaba is experiencing, what you're experiencing, the absence of democratic culture and that kind of stuff. Are we not so, we're getting used to talking about democracy and failing to unpack it? I understand that poverty, living well and that kind of stuff and being a billionaire might not necessarily be connected to democracy. But I want us to seriously engage. What do we mean in Africa when we're talking about democracy? What do we mean? And by the way, I'm going to be chairing a panel of ambassadors to unpack this issue of democracy. Democracy in Canada, democracy in Germany, democracy in Australia. Let me remind you as I sit down that Donald Trump was elected in a democracy. Let that sink.
Very briefly, Chris, don't open the Constitution.
So, Section 1 of the Constitution says Zimbabwe is a unitary, democratic, sovereign state. That's what we should be. The enemies of democracy and human rights want us to believe that we are different, that human rights in Turkey is different from human rights in Zimbabwe. The rights in Tajikistan are experienced differently from Lusaka or Nairobi. Human rights are universal. Democracy is universal. Everyone wants to be free. At the root of democracy is freedom. People should live freely. They should be free to express themselves. And media freedom or press freedom flows from the general freedom that we fought for. I died for this country for freedom. crossing into Mozambique in 1972, fight for freedom. So my view is that there should not be too much debate about what it is to be free, what it is for a government to govern in the interests of the people, by the people, for the people, and people should have a say in how they are governed. I mean, I think it's very straightforward. This is the sort of democracy that we want. It's not complicated, but I do agree that it's useful to have a conversation or a debate about how our democracy should look like. But they are not very difficult questions. Are our laws reflective of a democracy? The Constitution, as I said in chapter 1, says we are a democracy. And that is a good thing. We have chapter 12 in this constitution, which establishes a number of commissions, independent commissions. I'm glad Susan Makore is part of this conversation. The Zimbabwe Media Commission is one of those commissions that are established to support democracy. So if we have shortfalls, Susan and your colleagues, you need to work harder to ensure that we have this ideal of democracy in the media space. And I do recognize that a lot of good work has been done. One of the tasks for the Zimbabwe Media Commission is to bring about good journalism, to ensure there is good journalism. And we must collaborate with those institutions to ensure that we practice good journalism. So there are a variety of other institutions, entities. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is established to ensure that, to support democracy and to ensure that we're
Okay,
a
Chris,
good democracy.
In the interest of time, I'm very sorry.
Okay.
But just 30 seconds.
All right.
How do we strengthen the demand side of rights?
The demand side of rights.
Yeah.
All right. So
30 seconds.
we must we must make use of the available platforms like courts of law, but we must also advocate. Civil society plays a critical role in the advocacy role, but we must also engage. We are not talking to each other enough. Those who govern and the governed, we must have more platforms for engagement so that we perfect our democracy.
Thank you very much, Chris. Helen, 30 seconds. Media policy, regulation, co-regulation, self-regulation. How do we strengthen that part and where do we go from here? Because we've been stuck in this rut for several years now.
I think we need to continue with the dialogue, but make sure that we achieve concrete results. The principle of co-regulation is a welcome principle, but we need to concretize it in legislation. So we need to move towards that enactment of the legislation that will serve as the guiding legislation for media.
Thank you, Helen. Judy, 30 seconds. There's a disconnect between training and practice. How do we marry those two?
Continuous mentorship, resilience, and the continuous talk, especially on emerging issues, emerging trends, and basically quality of journalism is the key. It's what will defend us, and it's what we can use in courts to challenge those who fight us.
Thank you. About 30 seconds. Okay. The last time I checked, Trevor, I haven't seen you in several years. You were a Christian. I'm not much of a Christian myself. Last time I was in church was at my wedding in 2016. I don't plan to go there anytime soon. But there's one thing that stuck with me from my upbringing at a Christian school, was that when the children, probably of Israel, not too sure, were being bitten by snakes, they were dying. I think one of the prophets, sorry, they confused me. One of them spoke to God, and God said, "Put a snake on a." It was Moses saying, "Put a snake on something at the top there, and if the children of that community look towards the snake, they shall be healed." Democracy might have problems; it might be biting us, but there's still one way to look towards. Thank you very much.